After Adolf Hitler, the man who stood closest to him wasn't a decorated general or a silver-tongued diplomat. It was Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer. To many, he was Hitler's shadow, his most loyal disciple. But in 1941, that shadow broke away. On the night of May 10th, Hess climbed into a Messerschmitt fighter, flew alone across hostile skies, and crash-landed in Scotland. Not as a warrior, but as a desperate envoy. His mission? To cut a secret deal with Britain that could reshape the war. Instead, he became something far stranger. The most mysterious prisoner of World War II, haunted by secrets he carried to the grave. On the night of May 10, 1941, the German army launched its final air raid on London. The surprise attack by German bombers set fires raging across the streets, and it took several days before the flames could be extinguished. Bombs rained down on London, but one aircraft flew in the direction of Scotland and crashed near Kilmarnock, just a few miles from the city of Glasgow. The pilot of that plane was immediately captured, and, to everyone's astonishment, that man turned out to be none other than Rudolf Hess, Hitler's closest aide. Rudolf Hess carried out his flight to Britain at a decisive moment in the war, in May 1941, when Germany held the upper hand in the North African campaign. General Erwin Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox, commanded the German Africa Corps. The Germans defeated the British, seized Cyrenaica, and advanced to Benghazi. From the other side of the Mediterranean, another German pincer movement cut off the British, forcing the British Africa Corps to retreat. Repeated German air raids continued to inflict defeats on the British. At the same time, Hitler was preparing his plan to invade the Soviet Union. After Germany occupied France in 1940, Hitler began to set his sights on the East. Britain remained defiant, ignoring threats of invasion if it refused to negotiate with Germany. The new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, called on the people to fight. Hitler's blitzkrieg strategy failed in the skies, as the German Luftwaffe was defeated by the Royal Air Force. Forced to abandon his plan to invade southern England, Hitler postponed the invasion of the Soviet Union until Germany had built up greater strength. British intelligence obtained critical military information thanks to the Enigma code-breaking machine. They informed Soviet leader Joseph Stalin that Nazi Germany was planning to attack the Soviet Union. However, Stalin doubted the warning, since in August 1939, the Soviet Union and Germany had signed a non-aggression pact. While Hitler's main forces were massed on the Soviet border near Poland, Rudolf Hess carried out a shocking move. On the night of May 10, 1941, his Messerschmitt Bf-110 crash-landed in a field in Scotland. He parachuted to safety, gave a false name, and insisted that he was carrying an important message for the Duke of Hamilton, whose estate was nearby. Hess landed not far from his intended target, but Hamilton was away on official duty. The first farmer on the scene later recalled that Hess appeared educated and polite. He proudly showed a photograph of his son and said, "I left him this morning, but God alone knows when I shall see him again." The locals suspected he was dangerous, yet they were surprised by his courteous manner. During his captivity, Hess behaved strangely. On several occasions, he even attempted suicide. Germany declared that Hess would never be allowed to return, claiming he was nothing more than a hostage of the British. But was this simply Goebbels' political statement, or the truth? Meanwhile, in London, the British codebreakers and MI5 counterintelligence carefully handled and released selective information through neutral diplomatic channels to test the reactions of other nations. The British wanted to know whether an opposition force against Hitler existed within Germany, while the Germans wanted to gauge whether Hitler should be removed. This intelligence battle seemed to tilt in Britain's favor. as they successfully spread disinformation that convinced the Germans an invasion of Britain was too dangerous. Several figures, such as Harrington and Hofer, were believed to be involved in these intrigues, and at the end of the war, they were executed by order of the SS. There is indirect evidence that as early as May 1941, the British had been anticipating the arrival of a figure from Germany. When Hess boarded his plane, German Labor Minister Arm Bavin had informed James Hill, based on reports from industry circles, that Hess was preparing to fly to Britain. Yet Hill kept silent, only revealing this information in 1969. It is suspected that Professor Willy Schmidt, from within the German industrial sector, may have been connected. If not, then perhaps it was Hitler himself who fabricated this story to conceal the truth about the preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union. According to records, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS security apparatus, had not yet been appointed to his highest position at that time, but he had a personal connection with Hess, having flown with him on early flights over the North Sea. Upon returning, Himmler reported directly to Hitler at the Führer's headquarters. Hitler himself always regarded communism as the sworn enemy, and still hoped to maintain an alliance with Britain. By allowing Hess to fly to Britain, Hitler knew the mission had little chance of success, since the Duke of Hamilton was not a political figure of great influence. Yet, such a failure could mislead Stalin into believing that as long as Germany remained in conflict with Britain, they would not open a second front against the Soviet Union. Whether Hess undertook the flight on his own or not, the political landscape remained unchanged. After the mission, Britain focused on defeating Germany, and since they lacked the strength to do so alone, they sought to draw the United States into the war. America's entry, alongside the Soviet Union, would ultimately shift the balance of the conflict. On April 30, 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin. On May 9th, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. The regime Hitler once claimed would last 1,000 years collapsed after only 12. But for Rudolf Hess, the war was not yet over. On October 8, 1945, he was brought to Nuremberg to stand trial alongside other war criminals. On the defendant's bench, Hess wore the same Luftwaffe uniform he had on when he landed in Scotland. He claimed to remember nothing about his final flight and refused to admit any guilt. However, in one public session, Hess suddenly declared that his memory loss was merely a political ruse, and that he was fully prepared to take responsibility for all his actions. After that, he appeared indifferent, without any hope for clemency, and was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment. Hess was confined to Spandau Prison in Berlin. From 1966 onward, he became the last remaining prisoner there. Throughout the Cold War, his imprisonment remained a contentious place to expend. Something about the strange pilot's face seemed familiar. Eventually, the farmers realized that their captive was none other than Rudolf Hess, Hitler's close friend and right-hand man. Hess had fought alongside Hitler in World War I, joined the Nazi Party in its earliest days, shared defeat with him during the failed 1923 beer hall putsch, and even went to prison with him, where he helped draft Mein Kampf, My Struggle. When Hitler seized power in 1933, Hess was appointed Deputy Führer of the Nazi Party. Though he lacked real talent, he was chosen for his unwavering loyalty. Hess imitated Hitler in every way, placing blind faith in National Socialism. But by the late 1930s, his influence had waned, overshadowed by more powerful figures such as Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler. Hess and Hitler both admired the British Empire, regarding the Soviet Union and communism as the real and most dangerous enemies. Hess believed he had found a way to safeguard the German Reich by seeking a peace agreement with Britain. He was convinced that within Britain there existed a faction willing to negotiate with Germany. In particular, he placed his hopes on the Duke of Hamilton, whom Hess had met during the 1936 Berlin Olympics, believing Hamilton could play a key role in brokering peace. From the summer of 1940, Hess had already been considering a way out for himself, while at the same time hoping to boost his prestige and bring peace with Britain. At first, Hitler forbade Hess from flying to Britain, but later gave his consent. Hess underwent special training to pilot the Messerschmitt Bf 110 and secretly planned to approach Hamilton through intermediaries. He even wrote a letter to Hamilton, but it was intercepted by British intelligence. The fateful flight, on May 10, 1941, was Rudolf Hess's last desperate attempt to secure a separate peace with Britain. Instead of success, he became the most famous prisoner of World War II. Hess went to the church to meet the Duke of Hamilton, who agreed but did not arrive. At 5:45 p.m. on May 10, 1941, Hess's Messerschmitt 110 took off from Augsburg Airfield without incident, flying across German airspace to the Atlantic coast. From there, Hess crossed the North Sea, approached the British coast, and eventually landed about 12 miles from his intended destination. Later, Hess confessed that only one assistant and his personal secretary knew of the plan. Even his wife was unaware, and so was Hitler. The Duke of Hamilton admitted he knew of Hess, but was greatly surprised by his sudden appearance. Many observers believed the entire affair resembled a stage play involving sworn brothers. When Hitler learned of the flight, he was furious, denounced Hess, and declared he would have him shot if he ever returned to Germany. The Nazi propaganda machine quickly claimed that Hess was nothing more than a deranged intellectual who had acted alone in a foolish enterprise. Hess was imprisoned in the Tower of London, becoming the last German prisoner held there. He once remarked that the Germans would respect the British Empire if only Hitler's arm could stretch across all of Europe. Hess also denied rumors that Hitler was preparing to attack the Soviet Union, insisting that he alone bore personal responsibility for the mission. However, Hess was never granted any formal meetings with the British political establishment. No negotiations ever took place, and he remained a prisoner until the war's end. The fateful flight, on May 10, 1941, was Rudolf Hess's last desperate attempt to secure a separate peace with Britain. Instead of success, he became the most famous prisoner of World War II. Hess went to the church to meet the Duke of Hamilton, who agreed but did not arrive. At 5:45 p.m. on May 10, 1941, Hess's Messerschmitt 110 took off from Augsburg Airfield without incident, flying across German airspace to the Atlantic coast. From there, Hess crossed the North Sea, approached the British coast, and eventually landed about 12 miles from his intended destination. Later, Hess confessed that only one assistant and his personal secretary knew of the plan. Even his wife was unaware, and so was Hitler. The Duke of Hamilton admitted he knew of Hess, but was greatly surprised by his sudden appearance. Many observers believed the entire affair resembled a stage play involving sworn brothers. When Hitler learned of the flight, he was furious, denounced Hess, and declared he would have him shot if he ever returned to Germany. The Nazi propaganda machine quickly claimed that Hess was nothing more than a deranged intellectual who had acted alone in a foolish enterprise. Hess was imprisoned in the Tower of London, becoming the last German prisoner held there. He once remarked that the Germans would respect the British Empire if only Hitler's arm could stretch across all of Europe. Hess also denied rumors that Hitler was preparing to attack the Soviet Union, insisting that he alone bore personal responsibility for the mission. However, Hess was never granted any formal meetings with the British political establishment. No negotiations ever took place, and he remained a prisoner until the war's end. Issue: Britain and the United States repeatedly attempted to secure his release, but the Soviet Union stubbornly refused. In his final years, Hess lived in obscurity, occasionally attempting suicide, before suffering a stroke in 1976 that left him nearly blind. In 1984, he turned 90 years old. On August 18, 1987, Hess was found dead in the prison garden, his body discovered hanging. The official cause was reported as suicide, but many suspicions lingered over his death. Some later reports even suggested that Hess may have been murdered by Britain's MI6 to prevent him from revealing secret wartime agreements. 7 months later, Hess's remains were moved from their temporary resting place to be buried near his parents' grave. On his tombstone was inscribed the words, "I dared." Indeed, Hess had dared, but in the end, he had failed. The story of Rudolf Hess's mysterious flight to Britain, as well as his death in Spandau Prison, remains to this day one of the great, unsolved mysteries of the Second World War.